J.R.R. Tolkien brought to us what I personally consider the Bible of fantasy stories. Every other fantasy writer since him was practically copying his work, and few have come close to being as enjoyable. There's a debate these days about who's the superior fantasy writer, Tolkien or Martin, but I'm not here to have that discussion. Instead, I want to look at one of the fantasy races that Tolkien worked with that every other fantasy story has tried to emulate for good or evil. In fact, the morality of these little green monsters has been the subject of debate for some cultures and even Gaijin Goomba, who I made a video on previously. If you hadn't guessed, we're talking about goblins. Or, as my dear friend Goblin Slayer likes to say, Goblins! Welcome to a discussion on the mythological and fantastical, and how it might have impacted history. What would the medieval world have looked like if fantasy creatures, races, and elements existed in that time? How would our world today be different? What would have happened? This is Fantastical History. Goblins have seen many different interpretations, so we'll try to look at the big prominent ones for now. We also need to set a standard for what constitutes a goblin, so let's start with the Tolkien version. The word goblin usually refers to a short, ugly, and mischievous creature with a pointed nose, green skin, and pointed ears. They also go by the name orc, as Tolkien said. Orc is not an English word. It occurs in one or two places in The Hobbit, but is usually translated goblin or hobgoblin for the larger kinds. In Tolkien's work, as well as most fantasy stories, goblins are evil, and they dwell away from the world of light. They are greedy, malicious, and self-seeking. They will kill humans, dwarves, elves, and any other race they encounter, including themselves. Most goblins are portrayed to being near the size of human children or teenagers, while a rare few might get larger like the Goblin King in The Hobbit. The lore of Lord of the Rings explains that goblins were bred for corrupting elves. Quote, "Yet this is held true by the wise of Eresia, that all those of the Quiendi who came into the lands of Melkor ere Utumno were broken, were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of orcs in mockery and envy of the elves, of whom there were afterwards the bitter foes." Goblins and elves, therefore, are complete opposites in outlook and disposition. Elves are graceful, wise, and love all things beautiful, gazing up at the stars with wonder and basking in their own sense of superiority. In contrast, goblins are wretched, loathing, and cruel. They live their lives below ground and detest the surface dwellers. But how are there so many? How do the goblins reproduce? In Chapter 3 of the Silmarillion, it says, quote, "For the orcs had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Iluvatar." Bear in mind that orc was one of Tolkien's ways of referring to goblins. This implies that there were female goblins and baby goblins. However, it is also implied elsewhere that goblins are a perversion of elves, twisted by the dark powers. While elves hold birth in high esteem and with respect and love, this is likely not the case for orcs, who likely treat it as little more than a breeding farm. Female goblins likely serve little more purpose than creating children, and so we're not talking about the Uruk-hai warriors who appear to have been born from mud pits. But again, we've only seen male goblins within Lord of the Rings, so it's hard to know exactly the manner in which this happens. Another goblin variant besides Lord of the Rings to analyze, though, which is very similar to the goblins of Tolkien lore, are the goblins of Goblin Slayer, which seem to represent a lot of media's views on them. Goblin Slayer takes a different direction with its breeding and goblin lore. Goblins there appear to be the size of children or toddlers, vastly unintelligent, but still clever enough to pick up new skills, unable to be reasoned with, and practically psychotic, being devoted to mayhem and carnage. According to Goblin Slayer, they steal and pillage because they're jealous of what they can't have and thus resent humanity for having what they don't. Goblins have no females and thus reproduce by taking female captives and breeding with them. When Goblin Slayer sees 5 babies hidden away, he states that if he had waited too much longer, the 20-something goblins he killed could have been more like 50.
18. These high-level ones are tough.
A secret door? Children.
They multiply quickly. If this nest had been left much longer, there might have been a horde of 50 waiting for us down here. We were lucky.
Implying goblin reproduction is rapid and disastrous. Goblins also seem to have a hierarchy, and they can have leaders, bodyguards, shamans, and champions.
Judging by the footprints the scouts left, they're led by a goblin lord. which means there's at least 100 of them.
100?
That many? He's gotta be kidding.
There's no way. It's impossible.
What's going on?
You lost too?
Yeah.
Lords are a mutated class of goblins that excel in leadership. Think of them as the top rank.
That sounds bad.
And the horde that it's leading will be here soon. There's no time.
Unlike the goblins of Tolkien's world, who are implied to have dark and disastrous technology, the goblins of Goblin Slayer must be taught or shown new technology and must learn how to use it. They do not learn on their own. This is why it's important to make this distinction.
They may not be smart, but I can't believe that's all it took to fool them.
The goblins learn to associate light with groups of adventurers because we always travel by it.
Really?
I'm not sure when they figured it out, but it's commonly known among them now. Their kind are nothing more than scavengers. They'd never think of building anything on their own. Again, they aren't bright creatures, but they're not total fools. They learn how to use items quickly. If they were shown a boat, it wouldn't take them long to learn to use it.
Well, aren't you Mr. Knowledgeable?
I've studied them. This is why I make sure never to give the goblins any new ideas. I kill them instead.
Finally, let's look at the Goomba interpretation of the goblins from, and we'll use That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime as reference. The goblins here are peaceful creatures. They are green and small like the ones we've discussed before, but they're clearly female ones, and these goblins can evolve into highly intelligent and stronger versions of themselves called hobgoblins. Goblins in this context are rational, friendly for the most part, and seeking to thrive and flourish, though they seem to lack specialization, seeming to require help from outside forces like dwarves and ogres to better themselves and their community, otherwise living as tribesmen. Alright, so the big question now, how would humanity react to such creatures? How would they be treated in medieval warfare? I'm going to be frank. Looking at malicious goblins first, they would be seen as monstrous. In the medieval age, when superstition was running rampant, the idea of goblins and what they're capable of would turn anyone against them, including the church. Let's assume they're like the goblins of Goblin Slayer, mostly unintelligent but capable of learning. The kind of creatures that kidnap women for breeding and kill indiscriminately. They will lack basic battle tactics outside of raiding massacres, and they are easily picked apart from a distance and torn apart by arrow volley or heavily armored knights. Some might be led by goblin lords or leaders who train them and organize them. This will prove more challenging. Some may ride on wolves, use live meat shields, or summon up large brutish goblin champions like in the show. Under these circumstances, heavy artillery would be employed. Burning land tactics might also be effective if the battle can take place outside the city. Most towns and cities will learn to erect walls or moats to prevent night raids by these monsters and to protect their citizens. All women taken captive or hostage would be treated as top priority rescues to prevent the goblins from breeding, as they seem to be very quick at it. They would be exterminated like a plague. But let's take it up a notch to the Tolkien level goblins, creatures that are far more cunning, clever, and capable of reason and tactics. Tolkien himself described the goblin thusly, quote, "It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosives always delighted them." The goblins in Lord of the Rings are shown to possess tactical skills with hierarchies, generals, kings, and leaders. They have destructive weapons and wear armor. Their greatest weakness is that they are unable to walk in sunlight, which Sauron fixed with the Uruk-hai by making them able to move in daylight. In this case, the danger of goblins would be even greater and may even have to go as far back as the Roman Empire to understand the threat they might pose and what answers humanity would have against them. Why Rome? Well, Rome was such a mighty military power because of their organization and vast control. This makes them one of the best cultures to strike an early blow against the goblins. The great fear we must confront is if goblins could learn how to use gunpowder. We know Saruman was able to figure out explosives and teach it to the Uruk-hai, but imagine when the age of gunpowder begins. Will the goblins learn how to manufacture it? Will they invent crude firearms to do battle? If this takes place, then the goblins will become a nuisance that might last almost indefinitely. But the medieval world has chances, and it starts with Rome. The goblins will likely make their homes in territories underground and in labyrinths, hiding from the sun during the day and moving around at night. This provides a key advantage. Goblins can't cultivate resources very well underground, and they must claim them from the surface world. Rome famously established roads and trading routes that, if guarded and manned properly, could prevent the goblins from gaining enough resources to sustain them. This might force them into desperate positions to fight for land and claim, and in this case, the Romans and the later medieval feudal lands do have the edge of daytime combat, likely superior artillery power, and a larger landmass of resources to pool from. Whereas the goblins, while fighting with crude weapons and armor, and likely impressive deadly tactics, would be forced to contend with few supplies to fall back on. The first thing to deal with in terms of the goblin in a war scenario is to deprive resources, learn where the goblin stronghold is, and begin evacuating the areas near their home, burning the farms and food behind you. Force the goblins to get desperate and leave their home. It's not a good idea to engage the monsters in their own homes, in which they have the advantage. Next, as the goblins prepare for their attack, spread out the lines of battle so as not to give the goblins an easy path around you. They'll want to flank you or find a way to escape direct battle if they can, at least if they're smart, and that'll be their plan. But if they have confidence in their strength, as many goblins are shown to be, then you can take advantage of this. The goblins will likely drop hasty battle lines, relying on sheer raw cunning or brute force to gain an early edge. They might resort to strange tactics as well, or bizarre means of attack. In both The Hobbit and That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, goblins are shown to occasionally have wolf mounts, or wargs in the movie. But this tactic too can be handled. Firstly, dealing with the wolf riders. Have a line of spearmen or pikemen resting behind your front line who can get to the front quickly and raise spears. Even if that doesn't stop the wolves, it's going to slow them down enough that you can deploy a volley of arrows to contend with them. Consider also that wolves are inferior to horses as mounts. Horses will charge together in a group because they can be trained to do this. They are also trained to run even in the face of danger. Wolves are pack hunters, and they have high intelligence. They're going to recognize danger when they see it, and it's unlikely the goblins have trained them to endure that kind of stress. Then you pull what I call the Hannibal Tactic. Those familiar with Hannibal know what he pulled off, considering the greatest battle tactic of all time. The forward line will appear weak. Have simple foot soldiers there with a few knights or cavalry, and using the artillery available, force the goblins to run down towards the center line to spearhead through. If the goblins are desperate enough, they might be willing to try a frontal assault, perhaps with assistance from arrow volleys or their own artillery. But considering they spend most of their time below ground, it's hard to believe they'd have much experience with siege engines. In this case, give goblins a clear target to gun for. Allow your center line to appear weak with foot soldiers and a few knights in reserve. The goblins will take the bait and think they can punch through your center easily enough. It's in this instance that once the goblins close in and begin attacking, begin pulling the line back some, allowing the goblins to push more and more into your line. But while this goes on, close the lines around them inward and on the goblins. This was the reason for the wide battle line in the first place. This is the Hannibal Tactic, closing in your forces on the over-anxious goblins, basically boxing in the larger force with your own forces. With them boxed in like this, they'll break ranks and begin falling apart. This might not destroy the goblins entirely, but it will allow a clear edge, and the resources and experience in large-scale war will give humanity a large advantage in this instance. Considering that Rome has always been very gifted in organized warfare, this will be to your advantage, since the goblins likely will not be as organized. But this begs another question. What about if goblins were more rational and not as evil like the ones from That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime? Well, honestly, that's not a good outlook either, for one very sad but honest reason. Difference. Mankind has always found easy reason to hate by simply seeking what's different. Call it racism, sexism, bigotry, whatever. We find reasons to hate each other. Why do the Armenians and the Turks hate each other? Why do the Japanese and the Korean hate each other? Why do the Polish and the Germans? Why do the French and the British? Why do all these people hate each other, even when they look similar? It's because there are differences, and people will use and exploit these differences to take what they want. Goblins, no matter how rational they are, would be seen as different. And if they sit on any territory that mankind wants, or they are seen as an obstacle to a certain culture or people, eventually, someone will use their difference as a reason to destroy them or break their spirits. And don't just assume that this is just evil Europeanism talking. It would happen in any culture, anywhere. Because any human will seek out difference as a reason to hate. Now, the way to avoid this is that the goblins can produce and contribute something that humans might be interested in trading for. But as most anime and media have shown, goblins don't specialize in anything, other than possibly rapid breeding and combat. They're not specialists in mining, manufacture, cultivating, or anything that would be possibly useful for trade. It frankly doesn't look good for goblins in any case. At best, if they're very good workers and breed rapidly, the best that might happen is they're used for slave labor. And as dark as that sounds, that's probably the best outlook they'd get. What they would need is some kind of skill or some kind of product that they could trade for, and thus making them valuable. But most media does not display what goblins offer that would allow this. My prognosis is that, in the best case scenario, goblins would likely vanish around the 18th century at the latest, or fall into basic slave labor, if they were good-natured. But if they're evil, they would probably be wiped out even earlier than this, because they would be seen as a dangerous nuisance. Goblins are a fascinating race to study, but whether they be evil or simply neutral, they are an element that humanity will likely see exterminated were it to be in real life. Thank you for joining us on Fantastical History, and we'll see you in the next video.
Down, down,